Okay, our next presentation, and the first one for semester 2, will be on plot structure. Okay, so what is plot? Plot is a literary element and it describes the structure of a story. It shows the relationship of events and actions within a story. So in this picture on this slide, you see a plot diagram. A plot diagram should be familiar to you. You should have seen it somewhere else in your education. The only thing I don't like about this plot diagram is that it isn't very clear that the falling action typically is much shorter than the rising action. In this diagram, it shows it at equal length. So the next two elements, or rather the first two elements in a plot, are the exposition and the setting. The exposition is the start of the story, the way things are for the characters before the action starts. The exposition also includes the setting of the story, and the setting is where and when the story takes place. The rising action is a series of conflicts and crises in the story that lead up to the climax. Now, typically the rising action makes up the bulk or most of the story. So when you're looking at a story, most of everything that's going to happen is going to be in the rising action, and it builds up toward the end of the story at the climax. So as I said, the climax typically occurs toward the end of the story. You can look at it maybe as the turning point of the story or as the most intense part of the story. Don't confuse the climax with an event, a triggering event that happens at the beginning of the story. An example of this would be in The Lion King when Mufasa is killed. That is not the climax. That is a triggering event in the beginning of the story that triggers a lot of the conflict throughout the rising action. And then the climax occurs toward the end when Scar and Simba fight. The falling action is any part of the action in a story that occurs after the climax. As I said earlier, the falling action is typically much shorter than the rising action. And the resolution is just the conclusion of the story. It ties everything together, all the threads that are left up in the story, and think about resolution as the conclusion. It's the conclusion of the story. Okay, so here is our example story. You should be familiar with it. It's The Three Little Pigs. I am not going to read it to you because it'll make the presentation very long and then nobody will want to listen to it. So what you'll need to do is pause. I'm going to just skip through the slides, and you pause on each one of these slides and read it, and then you can unpause and go to the next slide. So here's part 1 of the story. And this is part 2 of the story, so you'll need to pause the screen while you read it. And then pause while you read this screen. And pause for this portion of the story. And then pause and finish up wrapping up the story. So once you've read the story of The Three Little Pigs, which you probably know pretty well already, then you need to go ahead and answer the questions that follow. You're going to need to understand the story or maybe come back to this presentation because the questions that follow on this quiz are going to ask you to identify the different elements of plot as they appear in this story about the Three Little Pigs. And that is the end of our presentation.